I've been thinking a lot about light. One of the problems that I've been thinking about is the connection between physical light, the kind we study in physics, and light used in a whole host of other senses, like the light of consciousness, the light of reason, the light of understanding, or the light of God. And it seems to me that if these two kinds of light, it's not that one's physical and the other's just kind of metaphorical, but that in some sense they must be aspects of each other. They must be talking about the same thing, of which we're seeing different aspects. So this suggests there's some relationship between light and understanding, or light and vision. And then, of course, we realize there is a connection between light and vision. Light is the medium of vision. Vision not just in the visionary sense, but in the sense of ordinary visual perception. So then, if one thinks about ordinary visual perception and thinks, well, how much do we understand about the nature of vision? What is vision? What is seeing, of which light is the medium? Then we find that science doesn't really tell us very much. What it tells us is that light moves from the thing we see, goes through the eye, inverted image on the retina, patterns of electrical and chemical activity in the optic ganglia and nerves and in the cerebral cortex. And then somehow what we're seeing seems to spring up in a totally unexplained way as a subjective image of what we see somewhere inside the brain. And we then falsely imagine, according to the standard theory, that this image inside the brain, subjectively experienced we know not how, is then projected outwards until it appears to be in the place where the thing seen is. So if I'm looking at you, Terence, the light rays come into my eye, and then I have a subjective image of you, which is actually just my understanding or my subjective awareness of an electrochemical pattern in my optical cortex. That gives me somewhere in the brain a subjective image of you, which I experience subjectively and imagine is where you are, but actually it's inside the brain. That's the standard theory. And it seems to me an extremely peculiar theory of vision, because it has a one-way movement of light into the body. It has things going on inside the brain, and then the visual world we experience is imagined to be located inside the brain, and not around us where it seems to be. So what I've been considering is the idea that when the light comes in, the visual image is a mental image. It's definitely a mental and subjective image. My image of you is interpreted by me. It's a mental construct. But I think this mental construct may not be inside the brain, but right where you are, namely outside me. And this is an idea which is developed with great clarity by Bergson, who gives, in Matter and Memory, who gives the idea, the notion that what we see, our perceptual world, is all around us. And the idea that it's inside the brain corresponds not at all with our actual experience. It's just a theory. It's a theory of remarkable hallucinatory power, because we forget it's a theory quite quickly. Anyway, so if there's an outward projection of images as well as an inward movement of light in the process of vision, then if this outward projection has anything to it, if I'm not just playing with words, producing a different metaphor, there must be something moving out, some influence moving out, as well as the light moving in. And if so, people or things might be affected just by being looked at, if some influence is going out from the eyes as well as an influence coming in. Now at this stage, we recognize that the idea that things go out from the eyes as well as come in is a very old and traditional view of vision. It was present among the pre-Socratics. It's present in an implicit form all over the world in the fear and practices associated with the evil eye, which is supposed to be the outward movement of influences from the eye to the thing or person looked at. And we find there's also an enormous folklore in our own culture, known to everybody, about the phenomenon of the sense of being stared at, the feeling that people have when they think they're being looked at, for example, from behind, and turn around and indeed someone's looking at them. There seems to be an influence of the eyes that is actually detected by people. And 95% of the normal population in England, according to a recent survey, have actually directly experienced this. It's very common. Now, there's not been much empirical research on the sense of being stared at. 3 published papers in 100 years. And it's a subject that parapsychologists have ignored as well as psychologists. And it's, I think, oddly enough, the biggest blind spot in our whole view of the world, because I think it holds the key to moving to an entirely new paradigm, an entirely new understanding of the relation between mind and matter, or spirit and body. I've been doing experiments to test for the sense of being stared at. Most people aren't very good at it under sort of initial conditions. The only way is to do long series of experiments where people train the ability to do it under the artificial condition of experiments. But let's assume, for the purpose of discussion, that it can be established empirically that there is such a thing as the sense of being stared at. I mean, that's an empirically investigatable point. Assuming that there is some influence passing out of the eyes, which can be detected empirically in the sense of being stared at, then what kind of influence could this possibly be? What kind of influence could be moving outwards through the eyes as part of the image-forming perceptive process? And in this outward projection, in some sense, projects the image we see, or the image we see is part of this outward flux, or this movement outwards, the opposite direction to the incoming light. Now, there's 2 possibilities for explaining such an outward movement. One of them is that this outward movement is in a kind of mental field, let's say, which I'd think of as a morphic field, which is somehow over and above the electromagnetic field and has nothing much to do with it except for the fact the electromagnetic field sets up all the normally understood electrochemical changes in the brain, and then somehow an organizing or morphic field organizes and meshes in and relates to that field but is not itself part of it, and then projects out the image. That's one possibility. The other possibility, a more economical one, is that the outward projection process takes place by a reverse movement along the photons of light which are coming in. In other words, that when the photon comes in, it corresponds to an antiparticle moving out, a kind of opposite of a photon moving out. And that these outward moving influences that move along the exact track of the photons are associated with vision, perception, comprehension, subjective experience of an object, that they're, as it were, the grok wave, if you like, or the outward moving, somehow this vision is born on the reverse movement of photons. Since physically speaking, from the point of view of a photon, no time elapses as it travels, the connection between the source from which it leaves, the reflection from my skin, and the place where it arrives, namely a rod or a cone cell in your retina, there's no time taken, and therefore the contact is, from the point of view of the photon, instantaneous between the source and the sink. But an instantaneous connection, if there were a reverse flow of action, could mean that there'd be this kind of instantaneous grokking, as it were, and that the 2 would be connected together. And one is the subject, the other is the object, as it were, but through this connection together, there's this reverse flow between them. And so vision may be very closely related to light. Vision it would be too crude to say that the antiparticle of the photon is the vision, but there may be the missing link here between vision and light may simply be that the photon is in some sense reversible, and that the electromagnetic field is, in some sense, the field of vision as well. So that was one of the lines I've been thinking about, and because it has further implications. But so I just wanted to see what you thought about it.
Well, there are a number of questions to be asked here. I noticed you were careful to say that it wasn't that the vision was not simply the antiparticle of the photon, and I imagine this was because you anticipated the objection that if it were simply the antiparticle of the photon, then the phenomenon of light pressure should not exist, and it in fact does exist and is well studied, because the vision would cancel out the impelling force of the forward-moving photon, and so solar sails and things like that would not work.
Or it could be polarized differently.
This is no problem at all. We can allow that the photon is a particle with physical properties in the physical realm, and therefore exerts a physical pressure. Now, if the vision is in some sense to do with the conscious properties, or properties, let's say properties of understanding, that's moving in the opposite direction, setting up a wave in the opposite direction, and the sense of being stared at, for example, would be sensing that wave impinging.
Right.
As it were, there'd be a kind of pressure in that direction of the psychic kind.
Well, I think then a more elegant description of what you're trying to say is not to call the vision a particle which accompanies the photon, but to call this reverse wave phenomenon a quality of the photon itself. As you point out, from the point of view of the photon, the travel time to and from its destination is zero. Likewise, travel time from destination back to origin is zero. So why not simply take a page from superstring theory and visualize the photon as a kind of a particle which is stretched in one dimension and is both co-present at its origin and its destination simultaneously, and thus able to impart information at a distance by that means. You see, if you don't do that, if you say that the vision accompanies the photon but is not an anti-photon, then you violated a major symmetry in the edifice of physics, because the question can then be asked, well, what about every other particle? Does it have a ghost particle which is not its simple antiparticle, but which partakes of some of its properties, but not others? And I think you unleash a lot of messy speculation at that point. So I'd prefer a more complex
It might not be so
photon.
messy. It might not be so messy, you see, because the antiparticles of most other particles are antimatter. And antimatter, in some sense, doesn't exist.
Well, in what sense?
Well, first of all, that the universe is not symmetrical. If the universe had mostly its same amount of matter and antimatter, they would self-annihilate and we wouldn't be here. We're only here because there was an enormous change in symmetry between matter and antimatter, so that matter is predominant in our universe. For a start.
In this part of
At
the
least in this
universe.
part, well, yes, all right. But then in this part of the universe, you see, there's a tremendous asymmetry between the two, and antimatter has a symmetrical relationship to matter in our mathematical imaginations, but it doesn't in physical reality.
As we know it.
As we know it.
That's true.
So I would have thought that to follow this, if one did want to see, you see, I'm not so wedded to particle theories of, let's say that light moving in one direction, which already has pattern, quality, etc., is associated with vision moving in the other. To put it in the most general terms, we needn't bring in the photons necessarily, but we see still that the thing that moves in the other direction is in some senses its opposite, but in other senses is different, because it doesn't have as physical a reality as the light does. And that's exactly the same is true of the antimatter, which is supposed by symmetry considerations to be, at least originally, equal and opposite to matter.
Yes, I see what you're saying. Ralph, how do you take to this?
This discussion is very hypothetical. In fact, as hypotheses go, this is the big bag full. Certainly, if there was established that there was no effect could be produced in a person by looking at them from behind and so on, then this discussion is less interesting, although there still remain some serious outstanding questions about the M fields, about morphogenesis and
The relation of mind and matter, the nature of vision and light. These still remain questions.
They still remain questions. Nevertheless, it does seem very useful and correct to make this assumption that such a fact had been established. But this assumption then puts us at some time in the future, supposing that sometime in the past and so on. In that case, the science that we'd be using to carry on this discussion would be a different one than we've got now, and that's a further speculation that we're making. For example, if such thing were established, then that would be the first of all the various so-called paranormal phenomenon of recent decades in science to be validated and accepted.
Exactly, that's why I think it's so important.
Me too. But probably that means that a lot of paradigms would be shifted, and therefore we would also be seeking explanation of telepathy and other kind of things that have to do with vision at a distance, remote seeing, clairvoyance.
Second sight, is it?
Yes, I don't think it would automatically follow if this effect were established that people would think it had anything to do with eyes or light at all. People would say,
mind.
Yes, you've established that attention can be felt across space. And this is an establishment of telepathy. It isn't the fact that I'm looking at the back of their head, it's that I'm focusing my attention. And you know, it's most effective when you really bore in. Well, output of the optical system is not increasing. Output of the mental act of concentration is what is increasing.
I just wanted to get to the end of this sentence.
Go for it.
If we agree then in the implication of this hypothesis that science has been stood on its head, as it were, by the discovery of one paranormal thing, so all of them are fair game, we have to assume that field theory and so on would have expanded considerably so that various proposed mathematical models for the N field and so on would abound. And therefore, when we come to the your argument in favor of Model 2 over Model 1 on the grounds of economy, I don't think that would be effective. So therefore I'm posing this question to think about. Why isn't Model 1 actually more interesting, where we would think of the return influence from the receiver to the sender to be carried in possibly a different field for which any model would be fair game. I don't really see the sense of identifying let's say we have an experimental result that in laboratory people can get someone's attention from behind by looking, by boring in, as Terence says. Would it really be useful to propose the electromagnetic field as in any way an intermediary for that influence? Or would we rather just have another field that would be a conceptual model for the observed phenomenon, including its variation of force with distance and so on, trying to measure the speed of light, as it were, if it were measurable within that field, and see if there was any comparison and so on?
Yes. Well, I think that this question is actually empirically testable, and I'll tell you how. It's just occurred to me that one of the ways I'd thought of testing for the sense of being stared at is first train people to get sensitive subjects, so people can do it fairly reliably. Then try the effect of distance, staring through binoculars and so forth. Then doing it over closed-circuit TV, different rooms of the same house. Can they tell when they're being looked at through the TV? And if that works, real TV, people when they're seen live on the air by millions of people feel any different from people being with a blank camera at them where nobody's looking at them? Is there any different? Broadcasters say they can tell a big difference when it's live. And maybe it's just imagination, but whatever the reason for it is, that if one could find that this worked over TV, that people in a studio could tell when people thousands of miles away were looking at them, satellite and stuff. If it were going through a reverse circuit, it would then have to go through electrons through the TV screen, back through the wires of the TV set, out through the aerial, then through the electromagnetic field, and then back through other electronic apparatus to sort of vibrations of things inside video cameras. So I think that would be rather the field hypothesis in that case would be more economical. But then one could test out the rate of movement of that field, because if one could insert a time delay into the TV transmission, for example, 2 minutes or something, and then ask the person to say when they felt the thing hit them. I mean, it would be a very crude measure, this, but it could tell one whether it was moving at the speed of light, or at least anything roughly like that, or whether it took much longer, or what.
I think the stack of hierarchical hypotheses here is sufficiently thick to call this more or less fiction. And let's take an audience survey. Terence, do you think that it's more or less economical to assume that this kind of influence is carried in a new or more or less fictitious end field invented to model this phenomenon alone, or to try to cram it into the electrical wire?
I think I'd have to go for a new field.
Me too. And furthermore, the idea of identifying this field, well, thinking of this phenomenon as mental. I mean, this, I think here's the bottom line. Since ancient times, we have thought of the mental, physical, and spiritual phenomenon as operating in different planes. And I think that these planes used metaphorically by the ancients and the rishis of India and all the other mystical cultures are more or less what we're calling fields. And so they have found it useful to separate these fields. So if we get a physical perception, whatever that word means, I'm not sure, the same as reception. We get, anyway, some photons, and then we get a mental picture, or we get a brain picture, we get a visual cortex picture, and then somehow this is, by resonance, becomes a mental picture in the mind, and so on. Then that has suggested a resonance between these two planes, an object, as it were, in the physical, and an object, as it were, in the mental. Now, the electromagnetic field is physical, at least I think of it as physical, although physicists might think of several parallel planes where there are different fields operating, like the strong force and the weak force and so on, the gravitational field, but thinking of all of that as collectively as the physical field. And I like, this is prejudice, I like the idea of the separate mental field. I like the idea that you had mentioned before of the mind somehow follows the eye out and extends itself so as to actually engulf the object, so as it were to know it through an intimate touch, that cognition could be a kind of engulfing, like paramecium eats the food. That this motion then is visualized in the mental plane, and therefore belongs to a different field. Now, we're not inquiring as to the actual structure, the true structure of the phenomenal, mental, and spiritual universe. Only what kind of models are useful to us, and economy is not the only consideration. So coming from a deep habit, an old runnel of thought with mental and physical being separate fields, I guess I'm feeling a bias toward that view. On the other hand, if you could show that this telepathy, or whatever it is, the transmission of an influence from one person to another, could be modulated electromagnetically by holding a magnet here that would strengthen, then that would strengthen the idea of the association, the actual proximity of the two separate planes, without even then suggesting to identify them.
Yes, well, I mean, there's a part of me, you see, that thinks the separate field idea is more attractive. But I've been leaning over backwards to try and see whether, instead of introducing separate fields, one can come to a new understanding of the electromagnetic field, and that the connection between vision and light may be a very, very close one. And so that even if there is this other field involved which moves out and engulfs it, this other field may be in intimate resonance with the electromagnetic field, as it may be in the brain. I mean, there's no doubt that the changes in the nerves are largely electromagnetic patterns, and there's scope for resonance there. But the light that's coming to our eyes is a complex. The fact I can see you, all that complexity is in the light that's coming to my eyes. And if this thing is resonating with the whole field of vibration, then indeed it will connect me through the light, because the field of vibration is between us in the light, and comes from you and it comes to me. And so anything that resonated with the light that's in between us would indeed directly connect us, as it were, via the light.
Well, I have trouble with this, the particle view. I'm more comfortable with the wave metaphor, and since experts assure us that they're more or less equivalent, let's just think of waves. Here I am looking at these waves on the ocean, and I see that there's a rock out there, and as the waves pass the rock, their shape is changed, and somehow there is a hologram of the rock is the wave that comes forward, it crashes on the beach, and then there's a reflected wave that goes back. And I think that the electromagnetic field, as theoretical physicists or something view it anyway, is something very, very like that. It's has a mathematical model which is a wave equation, and the speed of light in the waves, and you see the ripples going along, and so on. Then this does seem a suitable medium for influence to go both ways, but somehow I don't see it as having a rich enough structure to model all of mental processes.
I'm not suggesting all mental I'm only modelling vision on this so far.
Yes, so to see that the visual part of the mental field as part of the M field, the visual part is maybe just a very thin slice, which is somehow in very intimate contact and close resonance with the electromagnetic field. That must be right. But to identify them for sending influences around between people, I think, is very limiting. But it would be somehow better to carry on the conversation about the model of the phenomenon after seeing the phenomenon and the result of actually these experiments with the video and so on.
Well, yes, except that, one doesn't have to wait for empirical results to discuss the possibilities. And the reason why I think it's a bad strategy to wait for empirical data is that if one thinks through this phenomenon, if one thinks it through, one can derive perhaps other experiments which are simpler and easier to do, and which might even correspond to existing data.
Maybe it's a question of this. It's the Terence said, what was it you said about this is your definition of progress, things progress toward a higher level of integration or something. So the urgent desire of Einstein and other physicists for a unified field theory is an expression of this universal urge for progress. And here we have Rupert, I think, lusting after this unification that I think is maybe this is a really good idea if we can put it this way, that the electromagnetic field is to be thought of as an integral part of the M field, of the mind, of the soul of the world. That it just belongs in there, more in the mental part of the picture than the physical.
Well, I think surely if we do have the idea of interfacing planes, if you were trying to take your metaphor of the levels, the old idea of different levels, with the planes being thought of as fields, in the physical universe we do actually have a series of stratified levels. We've got the quantum matter fields, which are to do with the strong and the weak nuclear forces in atoms. And the quantum matter fields are supposed to determine the shape, structure, properties of atoms and molecules. But once you get they only work over very short ranges. The electromagnetic field is what actually holds together atoms and molecules and crystals more than anything else. And the electromagnetic field becomes the kind of higher organizing field of more complex structures. So one could say the electromagnetic field is the associated with, or the medium of the morphic fields, if you like, of molecules and crystals. And then then when you get to plants and vegetative growth, there's a morphic field of vegetative growth which interfaces with the electromagnetic field somehow as the lower level field. It sort of intervibrates with it. And then that can be included in animals within what Aristotle called the animal soul, which is the organizing principle of instincts and movements, which organizes and coordinates the activities of the nervous system. And then you can have hierarchically higher planes above that, more embracing fields, perceptual fields, fields of sort of higher level understanding, etc., which work down. So you have this plane of fields which are like the planes, but they're in a nested hierarchy. And then the gravitational field embraces all. It's the, as the universal field.
I got it. Novum organum. New order of the universe, which there's more fields. The electromagnetic field, as a constituent component of the end field, the mind field, or the world soul, should be utilized economically to carry as much of the burden of explanation as possible. And certainly all of these morphogenetic phenomena about crystals and so on they're so intimately connected by resonance with the electromagnetic field that the EM field itself might be enough to explain this evolutional structure. Terence, I think it's time to bring up dowsing.
Well, you mentioned evidence for this sort of thing, which is then ignored. I mean, dowsing passed through my mind. Pheromones is another possibility here. There are not only electromagnetic fields, but there are chemical fields, and I think that pheromones are vastly underrated for their organizing power in biology and social systems, and that in fact the whole Earth may be essentially chemically regulated through very small molecule organic compounds that are a byproduct of the metabolism of various species, but which percolate out through the environment and set up the field, the ambiance in which a lot of animal and plant business is done. I mean, to me, the vegetative mind and all this, there have to be mechanisms for all this influence, and I think probably easily volatilized, low molecular weight compounds are running a lot of this. It's even conceivable that Rupert's experiments on looking at the back of people's heads would show that it worked in a room of this size, but that the television transmissions would fail, and that would argue to me that it was in fact pheromonal. I mean, if materialists can seriously argue that the crystallization phenomenon has to do with seed crystals moving around on chemists' beards, then they will certainly be in agreement that the percolation rates of nature are effective enough to move these control and message-bearing chemicals around everywhere.
Well, this idea, I think, is very supportive of Rupert's economy move, because the olfactory bulb is nothing but a transducer from the chemical field to the electromagnetic. For example, in Walter Friedman's model, just a small number of molecules of the scent, the pheromone, is enough to excite the identifiable morphology of electromagnetic wave across the bulb, which is then identified by some kind of associative memory living primarily in the electromagnetic activity of the brain with whatever is the association for that scent. So there's a coupling that kind of shows the electromagnetic field as an intermediary between the chemical field and the mental field. So we have
which it obviously is, because the chemical field is simply a higher order manifestation of the electromagnetic field, because these most of these volatile compounds have very electronically active ring structures. And
yes, it's a resonance phenomenon.
Exactly, charge transfer and resonance and all of this stuff is happening. It is the most electronically active molecules that are the drugs, the pheromones, the growth regulators, and so forth.
Yes, so here we've got sensors that respond in a kind of electromagnetic resonance to these things, which then could, by morphic resonance, bring into play a much larger field of memory and association. But the interfacing would be electromagnetic again. And in hearing, you see, if we follow through these lines, the smell isn't localized anywhere particularly. Our vision, when I see you, you are localized somewhere outside me where you are. If I hear you, the sound is also localized outside me. I don't hear sounds as if they're arising inside my auditory cortex. I hear them as if they're rising around me in three-dimensional space, and I can locate, in fact, which direction they're coming from.
Mm-hmm.
So this means that we must not only be surrounded by a kind of visual perceptual field that spreads out from us and fills the space of our perception right out to the distant stars when we look at them. But we also are surrounded by an auditory perceptual field, which is again located around us. And it means, therefore, that something must move out. The sounds come in, and something must, as it were, move out from us in the opposite direction to the sound. Well, this perhaps militates against the photon argument, because in this case it would have to be a kind of antiphonon that was moving, and it would move at the velocity of sound, not the velocity of light, if it was the kind of shadow side of the sound wave that was used as the medium.
And its undetectability is going to be troubling.
Well, people may be able to tell when they're being listened to. And you sometimes doubt it when you see some people talking. But there's a simple experiment here. You have people talking, saying a message down a telephone, and at the other end, according to some random program, you have somebody listening to what they're saying or not listening. And you have to, they have to be able to tell you when they think they're being listened to. That's a simple experiment. It can be done by anybody. If it's done locally at local call rates, it would be very inexpensive, not requiring a large grant or anything. Work with radio, too.
Uh-huh.
I just think it won't work. You look at the ocean and you see it has infinite structure and complexity, and nevertheless, it could never function as a brain. I think that, the brain is, in the neurophysiology it presents to the experimentalist, certainly much simpler than the mind. Mm-hmm. It's a poor shadow of a mind. And its structure is definitely richer. It cannot function through an electromagnetic field alone, even though all of the effects are kind of manifest in the electromagnetic field. For example, a given thought might be a pattern where electromagnetic fields in the extracellular space control clouds of calcium ion, for example, that we can think of them as clouds in the sky that are being pulled this way and that electromagnetically, and then if there's a large number of them adjacent to some empty receptors or something. Well, this motion of the cation is through the electromagnetic field, but the electromagnetic field without some charges moving around can't really manage to control all these multidimensional patterns where you have the layered structure of cortices with pyramidal cells connecting, and then you have solid bodies of stuff like the glial cells, that the actual materiality of it, the fine structure with the ion channels and this and that, somehow that structure is much richer than the electromagnetic field. Just to think on the level of mathematical models, you have an excellent mathematical model. Not to identify these models with the field, but just to think of an idea of a measure of the complexity of one of these fields as currently conceived by us would be the complexity of the mathematical model currently in vogue. So we have Maxwell's model for the electromagnetic field. It's all described by a tensor field to a bivector. It has 4 indices. It takes this much complexity. A simple tensor field describes the electromagnetic field, their relationship in regard to an observer moving through at whatever velocity in the context of special and general relativity and so on. For the physical fields in the brain, the usual models are tensors that are much larger, that take into account this physical structure, symmetries, the creation and destruction of symmetries moving around, and so on. So the brain, as described by currently the better mathematical model, which is, it'll get much more complex as time goes on, it requires much more mathematical structure to even discuss the thing or imitate its behavior than does the mathematical model for the electromagnetic field. And that brain is much closer to the physical universe than to the mental. So I think the electromagnetic field is too thin to occupy more than a fraction of a fractal dimension of the entire structure of the field, carrying recognition, memory, how to serve in tennis, and learning a new language, and recognizing haiku, and all this.
Yes, well, I am somewhat inclined to agree, but I think somehow it has to be play this kind of interface role between the chemical and the psychic, or the morphic realm. If it has to interface with morphic fields somehow, because one has to have these planes linked together. There's another question you see that arises: how does the electromagnetic field interface with the quantum matter fields of the electron? Because the electron and the nucleus, its structure, and the electrons in their orbit are held in those orbits by quantum matter fields, not by electromagnetic fields. In fact, being opposite charges, if it were just electromagnetic, electrons would plummet into the nucleus. So the structure is actually maintained by fields which in a sense are stronger than the electromagnetic field, which resist it and override it, and the electromagnetic field sort of works around those fields. It's a more subtle field, but it works around them. So we've already got one model. I don't know how much attention people have paid to the interface of those two fields, but they are separate kinds of fields. And they interface because the electron and the nucleus are electrically charged, but at the same time their structure is made of quantum matter fields.
Yes, well, if Nick Herbert were here, he'd say that it was the quantum matter field and not the electromagnetic field. Maybe he would say that was the intermediary between the physical and mental planes. So the brain, as described by currently the better mathematical model, which is, it will get much more complex as time goes on, it requires much more mathematical structure to even discuss the thing or imitate its behavior than does the mathematical model for the electromagnetic field. And that brain is like much closer to the physical universe than to the mental. So I think the electromagnetic field is too thin to occupy more than a fraction of a fractional dimension of the entire structure of the field, carrying recognition, memory, how to serve in tennis, and learning a new language, and recognizing haiku, and all this.
Yes, well, I mean, I am somewhat inclined to agree, but I think somehow it has to play this kind of interface role between the chemical and the psychic, or the morphic realm. If it has to interface with morphic fields somehow, because one has to have these planes linked together. There's another question you see that arises: how does the electromagnetic field interface with the quantum matter fields of the electron? Because the electron and the nucleus, its structure, and the electrons in their orbit are held in those orbits by quantum matter fields, not by electromagnetic fields. In fact, being opposite charges, if it were just electromagnetic, electrons would plummet into the nucleus. So the structure is actually maintained by fields which in a sense are stronger than the electromagnetic field, which resist it and override it, and the electromagnetic field sort of works around those fields. It's a more subtle field, but it works around them. So we've already got one model. I don't know how much attention people have paid to the interface of those two fields, but they are separate kinds of fields. And they interface because the electron and the nucleus are electrically charged, but at the same time their structure is made of quantum matter fields.
Yes, well, if Nick Herbert were here, he'd say that it was the quantum matter field and not the electromagnetic field. Maybe he would say that was the intermediary between the physical and the mental planes.
But Ralph, if you feel that the electromagnetic field is inadequate to what Rupert's asking of it, then you must be equally skeptical of the morphogenetic field. It sounds to me like what you're saying.
No, I'm not skeptical. I think that what we're trying to do is, through the revision of the actual phenomenon of life, of our experience, to make up a model for some of the phenomenon, which now modelers, scientists, prefer to totally ignore. And the electromagnetic field and its history as a modeling effort, its hermeneutical history is an excellent history to imitate. And that what we must do is try to fashion a field concept around the phenomena that have been ignored. And it does seem very attractive to think of the electromagnetic field as some kind of favored intermediary among all the physical fields. Well, let's just put it this way, that perhaps the end field, or the mind of the world, the oversoul or whatever, will end up with a mathematical model which is simply field theoretic, maybe with many dimensions, and that is coupled only to the electromagnetic field. And the electromagnetic field, of course, is coupled to all the other physical fields, and through that intermediary. So this is a combination model, a sandwich model, which might be successful in explaining perception, cognition, idiosyncrasies of time, and that there would be sort of eventually a general relativity theory for the M field, which would explain time anomalies like clairvoyance and so on. And in that case, I think what we're talking about now is the conception, the struggle to envision the coupling between the M field and the electromagnetic field, including wave metaphors, particle metaphors, and so on. That's kind of what it's about. At least Model 1 you described at the beginning explicitly in these terms.
That's right. Well, my first model, you see, has always been that the perception and mental activity must have a kind of field-like structure. They'd be morphic fields of some kind. These perceptual fields are in turn part of these behavioral fields, which involve action as well as perception. The perception and the action are linked together. It's not motiveless perception that one's usually carrying out. It's linked in some way to action. Bergson said all perceptions are potential actions or possible actions. There's a sense in which they're very closely related. So this was my first model, and I thought of the sense of being stared at as a way of testing for the existence of this other kind of field. It then occurred to me that there's this mystery of light. I still think, you see, that Maxwell's electromagnetic formulations of light are much too simple. You see, whereas you were saying the model of the brain, to get the complexity out of it that's in it, would have to be more complex than his equations. That's obviously true. But when I'm seeing you, all the information about you, everything that's transferred to me through my vision, is coming through the electromagnetic field. And Maxwell's equation couldn't.
Well, is it? I mean, are we not then buying the oversimplification of the physicist in assuming that? Why not have a full mental wave traveling from my mental being to yours as a wave phenomenon or a particle phenomenon, resonance phenomenon that takes place in the mental field alone?
Plus you exist in a cloud of pheromones that are also transducing information.
Yes, but in parenthesis about the pheromones, this staring at test can exclude those by being done through double glazed glass windows.
But in fact, in all cases when it's been done that we're aware of, hasn't the possibility that the pheromone was carrying the effect been
No, it's been done through windows. One of the most common anecdotal sources of this is people who tell me that when in traffic jams, they're stuck in traffic jams or at traffic lights with the windows rolled up, you know, and the air conditioning on, and the window. They look at the back of the neck of women in other cars who turn round. I mean, there are a lot of men who find this a favourite pursuit at traffic lights. I've had many anecdotes told me of this kind, and that's through 2 lots of glass.
No, that's pretty good.
So I think that...
No, but even if you could handle this, if you could explain this with pheromones, that means that I would have to have the capability to focus my pheromones on a single person with mental power alone, or visual, or looking, or whatever it is. So
it's not a very good hypothesis. Anyway, I think it could be empirically excluded at a very early stage through these glass partitions. So back to the physical... the electromagnetic field. If one wanted to model the information coming, you know, through, if one did want to model it properly, how I could see you through the electromagnetic field, you'd need more than Maxwell's equations. Yes. And the thing is that the way we treat light is we take for granted the information that travels through it. Virtually everything we read is going through the electromagnetic field. All the information in libraries we access through it. I mean, everything that human knowledge is capable of in a stored or written form is mediated through it.
We'd be in a pickle without light.
We'd be in a pickle without light, and so Maxwell's equation does seem a little simple to model the transfer of the entire stock of human knowledge.
Well, we've come to the crux of the problem, because Maxwell's equations was made up to model the observables, and it did a really good job. And here we're kind of stuck for lack of observables, in spite of this anecdotal evidence, which to me has the same force as a report from the Argonne National Laboratory. Nevertheless, I think that we ought to think about the possibility that this effect will not be confirmed in laboratories, which is already the experience of so many experimental efforts over these years with the cards and so on to confirm the so-called paranormal. Whereas there is evidence, it always seems to be just the slightest bulge of the curve to the right or left of the absolutely insignificant result, that these phenomena that we want to capture in a model don't seem to be very robust. And they come and go because, due to the fact perhaps that they live primarily in the mental field, they're very subject to the noise, the heat bath in the mental field, which maybe all the time I'm trying to get the person to turn. Somebody else somewhere is trying to get them not to turn. Or they're trying to get somebody else to turn. I mean, I don't know. For whatever reason, these effects are very difficult to confirm. And I'm thinking of that as being a kind of evidence in itself. That on the one hand, we have the very widespread impression that these things exist on behalf of many people, dowsing and so on. And on the other hand, the impossibility to confirm them in the experimental paradigm of modern science. That somehow this is just suggesting to me the necessity for a thicker model, a richer field in which to try to do the modeling, where there's just chaotic attractors everywhere and no homeostasis or anything like that.
Well, yes, I agree we need a thicker field to deal with most of these parapsychological phenomena. I suspect the sense of being stared at may be different under laboratory tests. You see, whereas the others have proved evanescent and hard to pin down, it's not that this has proved like that, it's that this is something that parapsychologists, for some mysterious reason, have assiduously ignored. And there literally are 3 published papers in the literature, and I gave a lecture on this 3 or 4 months ago to the Society for Psychical Research. I gave a lecture called The Sense of Being Stared At. And there all the veterans of the British Society for Psychical Research were present, you know, ghost investigators of yesteryear and hardened experimentalists and so on.
Ectoplasma now.
Yes, you know, veterans of many seances and so on. They were all there, and all the luminaries of the society, and not one of them had ever thought of this as a paranormal or psychical phenomenon after 50 years of psychical research. They told me so afterwards. They were fascinated by the lecture because, in a sense, this really has been a blind spot of parapsychology. And if you look through any textbook on parapsychology, there's nothing, no mention of the sense of being stared at.
Well, will this result in some new experiments then, or what must we do to stimulate some research?
Well, I'm working on it. First of all, I've decided that I've got to try and train myself. I've got this biofeedback training system for this. You have 2 people. One sits with their back to the other. The other tosses a coin. If it's heads, you stare at them. If it's tails, you look away and think of something else. And so you make a click when you've done the coin, you're ready to stare. If it's heads, you then stare. And the other person from the click knows the trial's begun. And then they say yes or no, depending if they think they're being stared at. And they're right or wrong. You record the result. And then you tell them correct or incorrect. So there's instant, like, biofeedback. And one can train oneself to test various subtle, I've done hundreds of trials of this, test various subtle sensations. And the interesting thing is that most people are more often right when they are being looked at than when they're not. But the reason I wanted to discuss this in the first place is that I actually don't know which to think. I don't know whether it's better to adopt the electromagnetic hypothesis, which has certain it has the attraction of giving another side to the phenomenon of light, which most people think is just physical, and it's all in textbooks. Because I think light's far more mysterious than that. And it also, that's one advantage. The second is that it then takes us into a whole other area, which is that this metaphorical use of words like the light of consciousness, and the fact that when we dream, we see things in a kind of light. We do have a kind of inner light, which illuminates psychedelic visions, dreams, daydreams, visual images with your eyes closed. There's some sense in which our imagination, our image-making facility, is self-luminous. Now, is that kind of light, if understanding or perception, if vision is related to normal physical light, here we may have something where the physical light comes first and vision comes second when we're looking at somebody. You know, if you turn the light off, you don't see them. But in this other case, it may be the other way around, and their relationship may be expressed in the reverse sense. Yeah. That if you have vision, in the visionary sense of vision, that vision may itself generate light through an association between vision and light, so that at least subjectively they're self-luminous. And then if somebody has visions enough, according to all traditions, they start developing halos, and their bodies actually become luminous, according to mystical and spiritual traditions.
It's interesting. According to one school of pharmacologists, attention is the thing they most suspect being mediated by DMT, because DMT is so quickly able to be brought forth and degraded. It's very has a fast reaction time, which is exactly what you need in a system where you're going to throw attention first from one object to another. And these tryptamine hallucinogens certainly fill the head with light. I mean, if you take the intensity of the visionary experience as an index of the intensity of inner light, then they release this. And they're near relatives in brain chemistry. Serotonin is transduced to melatonin by a light-mediated reaction. In other words, light actually enters through the eyes, and a part of the visual pathway breaks off and goes to the pineal gland, where photons work a chemical change on serotonin and turn it into melatonin. And so the tryptamines, their near relatives, all this stuff is going on in the pineal, and it's all light-driven chemistry.
Nevertheless, it seems that this kind of vision has nothing to do with light, with the electromagnetic field. So even though these neurotransmitters are very photosensitive, the fact is that in the dark you have very bright visions, so that the neurochemical activity in the visual cortex or somewhere is, as it were, mimicking the effect of the photons falling upon the visual, on the retina, producing a chemical wave, etc. So in the alternation many times back and forth between electromagnetic and chemical waves in neurophysiological level, these psychedelics, for example, are taking over at some point and supplying what appears to be the result of the previous train of several reversals. So this illumination on that level, actually, the photons can be replaced, as it were, by this other messenger.
Well, it's interesting, this business of light. I probably tried this out on you in the past, Ralph, but one of my cosmological fantasies of years past was, there's this curious problem with the fact that the photon has no antiparticle. It's the only particle without an antiparticle, and this is a really sort of disturbing asymmetry in things. So who preceded me in this? I think Hans Alfvén, this Swedish cosmologist, he suggested that at the Big Bang, the reason there is such a low incidence of antimatter in this region of the universe is that actually the Big Bang was not a spurting of matter into the continuum, but that it went in two directions and out of a single point, like a double jet, and two bubbles were blown at once, in other words, and we are in one universe with a very high proportion of matter versus antimatter, and there is a twin of our universe, the anti-universe, and we cannot detect it or see it or transmit information between ourselves and it in any way. And in this anti-universe, every particle's antiparticle exists. Well, in a higher dimensional manifold, these things have gone off into the great void, but they are actually on a collision trajectory. of such a nature that after a certain amount of time they will re-encounter each other. And when this happens, because it's happening in a higher dimension, it isn't like a collision of two solid objects. It's more like the sudden, instantaneous superimposition of two objects, so that this cosmic collision, if you will, could actually occur across the entire face of the topological manifold instantly. It would be as though every particle in the universe underwent collision with its antiparticle at the exact same moment.
Three-dimensional blackout.
Yes, and at that moment, parity would be conserved. All particles in the universe would cease to exist except the anomalous photon, which would be in this moment in which all the rest of matter disappeared. The photons would then be left to obey the physics of a universe made entirely of photons. And what this would be, we can't say, but the form would be preserved in that final moment. All form would be turned to light. And
the body of the cosmos.
Yes, and so since tradition is so keen on resolving things into light, and what's also amusing about this kind of cosmology is that it's a totally apocalyptic cosmology. There would be no warning. This collision with the antimatter twin could occur at any moment.
Another vision of the end. Terence McKenna.
Of cosmologies, there is no end.
And of apocalypses, there is no end.
I think it might be useful, Rupert, to think about the habits of electromagnetic nature and the behavior of the electromagnetic field as evolving according to habits of the morphognetic field, explaining in this way the resonance between them. As above, so below. The EM field has created the EM field to do its bidding in the quantum matter level.
Well, certainly, you see, if the electromagnetic field, it is the bearer of all visual information in the world. I mean, of everything we see, of everything in every book, in every diagram. Now, this brings me to another fantasy or idea, as the electromagnetic field is an interface not just between the matter fields in us and the mental aspects or psychic or morphic aspects of our being, but also the electromagnetic field is playing a similar role in the mental structure of the soul of the world. You see, if the soul of the world, if there is a world soul which permeates the entire cosmos, which in its bodily level is mostly expressed in the gravitational field, but which at its sort of knowing or psychic or perceptual level is mainly expressed through some kind of interface with the electromagnetic field, the electromagnetic field would be a perfect medium for the world soul's omniscience, and then through the world soul for divine omniscience, because nothing that happens doesn't affect the electromagnetic field. The holographic reality of the electromagnetic field at any one moment is what's happening. At least it's in exact correspondence with what's happening. And so all the light in the universe, including the kind of cross-currents of memory that would be set up, for example, by the continued presence of the cosmic microwave background radiation, the fossil light of the Big Bang, it's still there as a kind of background. So there'd be even a kind of light memory built into the whole universe. So this similar model, you see, gives us the universal electromagnetic field as the universal basis of the world soul, of its knowing or perception or interfacing with other planes of reality, and as a medium of divine omniscience.
Well, I like the idea of the electromagnetic field being the chosen representative, the ideal intermediary that is positioned in the hierarchy of fields. In that way, its position in the hierarchy of fields is very much as the position of our individual consciousness in the hierarchy of consciousness in the world soul. And therefore we have in our individual consciousness a particular affinity with the electromagnetic field, with electromagnetic perception, reception, and so on, as epitomized by vision. And if this fantasy has any reality, then it seems like it should be easier if there would be phenomenon of mental effect, of the action of mind over matter. Then the easiest thing to affect should be the electromagnetic field. As in, dowsing is a sensitivity, direct sensitivity to magnetic field. Then you'd wonder, is it easy to, for example, to mentally influence a magnetometer?
Let me tell you one fantasy I've had for an experiment of this kind. You know those puzzle pictures that I did experiments with? You know, you have those black and white blotches. Did you see those ones I used in my experiments? When you recognize it, there's a visual gestalt is set up. You see the man on the horseback against the pattern of blobs, and you now see it differently. So if there's anything in this sort of thing coming out as well as coming in, when you look at that picture of black and white blotches, knowing what it is, as opposed to scanning helplessly for trying to find what it is, you should be seeing it differently. And in particular, where the lines, the outlines of the horse are, which you sort of fill in mentally, those lines should be reinforced as above other parts of it. Now, if this picture were produced by means of a liquid crystal display or something of that kind, where you could actually, we're full of sort of probabilistic processes that could actually be monitored in some way. I'm not quite sure how to do the technology of this, but some probabilistic light-sensitive processes that were built into this picture that you're looking at, you know, little units. It might be possible to pick up, when you explain to somebody, you have somebody look at it, you then show them the answer and they look at it again, and the pattern of output from this thing, as this pattern of probabilisms, may change, because it may be less random, now that certain lines and directions have been recognized and reinforced. And that might be a way, if one could possibly design the sensor side of this apparatus. It's a matter of finding something that's probabilistic. I would imagine that in the photographic film, whether the silver grains go or not is probabilistic, except with high light intensity they'd all go very fast. But I should imagine with very low light intensity it must be probabilistic. So one could possibly do it with some kind of suitably fine-grain photoemulsion thing, where one has a light intensity where it's a probabilistic matter whether you get the thing going over the edge or not. Do you see what I mean? Some experiment of that kind, some
maybe
sense
with a computer terminal or a photoluminescent screen, there might be a way to affect it by looking that someone else could see.
That's right. If it's a photoluminescent screen that's working probabilistically at a low level of intensity, you might be able to get a kind of enhancement of the luminescences along the outline, as it were. Just one more word on divine omniscience. You see, it seems to me that any theology of divine omniscience would require any all-knowing mind, any theory of any omniscience, whether it's the world soul as an intermediary, or God directly, or the goddess, or any form of omniscience, would require the divine mind to know everything. And since knowing everything would include knowing all the properties and states of the electromagnetic and the gravitational fields, one can be pretty sure that what's going on in those fields is essential to divine omniscience, just on general principles. But the usual model I've found when people think about divine omniscience is to think of it as an entirely miraculous process, totally disconnected from any kind of physical reality, somehow standing outside it. Yet, any reflection on this subject would show that divine omniscience must involve not just sort of somehow standing outside all things, but in sometimes being immanent within them as well, knowing from within, that's not just seeing from outside. And therefore must, in some sense, pervade the electromagnetic field. Just as Newton thought the medium of divine omniscience was space, absolute space, which he called the sensorium of God. Everything happens in space, and therefore as space is the sensorium of God, everything happens in God's sensorium, and God therefore knows where everything is and how fast it's moving.
Why is divine omniscience a necessary concept?
We need a little primer on divine omniscience.
I mean, can't the universe get along just being
nobody paying
partially
attention?
aware of what's going on?
Well, it depends whether you think there's any... There are a lot of people who think that if they're pantheists, they think that the universe is in some sense conscious, or the soul of the world in some sense is perceiving what's going on, not just entirely unconscious. And there are many theological traditions of divine omniscience. There are a lot of people who've got a stake in cosmic omniscience. I'm just stating this as a sociological fact.
And what is so good about it?
Well, that there's a lot to be said for models of reality. They're very popular, and I think that they're intriguing to think of models of reality in which there is a sense of knowing associated with the cosmos. I mean, it's in
But
so many religions.
isn't that different from, I mean, divine omniscience? We all have a sense of knowing, but we're not omniscient.
No.
What problems are solved by hypothesizing that notion?
It's to do with the question of the nature of our own minds. You see, there are two possible models. One is that our minds are the most advanced in the universe, and that's the standard model of secular humanism, that the rest of the universe is essentially unconscious, and that living organisms crawled out of the primal broth, and then through the miracles of random mutation and neo-Darwinian natural selection gave rise to organisms such as ourselves with complex nervous systems that happen to have this interesting subjective correlative consciousness. And this consciousness we have is emerged out of the darkness of the earth and the darkness of the universe, and is the highest consciousness there is. That's dogs and cats, may be a little way towards us, and it's conceivable intelligent beings exist on other planets, but basically this is it. That's the one model. The other model, the more traditional one, is to derive human consciousness from a much larger consciousness, which pervades the cosmos, pervades the earth, pervades the whole of life on earth, and that our consciousness has arisen by a kind of diminution or descent of some higher kind of consciousness, rather than ascent from a lower and finally from a non-existent kind of consciousness, that we're a reduced version, a self-contracted version of a higher consciousness, rather than an inflated version of a lower one or none at all. That's the biometaphysical background. I find it more reasonable to suppose that our minds are in touch with larger minds and in many ways shaped with larger mental systems, those of whole societies, the ecosystems, Gaia, the galaxy, the entire cosmos, and maybe a cosmic mind beyond that, or a universal. I think it more reasonable to think that our minds
Well, I
are
can
in
go
some
as
sense
far as a Gaian mind, because it seems a biological object, not a theological hypostatization. The mind of the whole universe, it seems unnecessary to hypothesize and unlikely to be encountered.
It's no problem. Suppose there was another Gaia, another inhabited planet. Then it will have its own Gaian mind.
And they will be citizens of the universe even as we are.
And between our Gaian mind and theirs, there might be a dialogue in progress.
Yes, but nothing of this suggests theology. This is just exotic biology.
You just projected theology onto it as an association with phrase divine omniscience, which is usually associated with Yahweh, the one God, and His divine omniscience. That is unnecessary to make that association. As soon as you have gone as far as the Gaian mind, you can certainly go further, as there is obviously a hierarchy of worlds up into the universe, as it were.
Yes, although I'm not convinced that the hierarchy is minded at every level. The universe is obviously a hierarchy, but if there were simply...
Does Jupiter have a Jupiterian mind?
Well, possibly, but a stranger question is, does the solar system have a mind? I think that's a sort of silly...
Now we've reached the limit. That's the interface to discuss then.
Yes, I think that's the interface, you see, because for me it seems entirely natural to suppose, on any holistic model of reality, that if Gaia has a kind of mind, the soul of the Earth, then the Gaian mind will be embedded in the solar system mind, and that in the galactic mind. And that these higher levels of mind, consciousness, being, which may be hard to conceive by us, are very likely to exist by a simple logical argument. I don't think that
although not necessarily in a hierarchical order. I mean, chipmunks are not small portions of whales.
No. But chipmunks are not inside whales. Chipmunks are inside sort of terrestrial ecosystems. They're small portions of terrestrial ecosystems. Whales are in different ecosystems, and both these, the oceanic and the terrestrial ecosystems, are part of the Gaia.
Mm-hmm.
So the hierarchy is of more inclusive units. The solar system is not on the same level as the Earth. It's a higher level of organization of which the Earth is part. The galaxy is a higher level of which the solar system is part.
So we need to decide whether we can have any interest in a lunar mind or not, or a solar mind.
I think it's an Earth-lunar mind.
Yes, I think the moon's part of the Earth as a system. It orbits the Earth. It's in its gravitational
It's in our blood.
It causes our time.
If you accept Gaian mind, do you think there's a similar kind of mind associated with Jupiter?
Yes, I think
without
planets
having
are animals.
Primates and so
yes,
on running
planets
around.
are like animals. But I don't believe that, I think that...
then there's a mental ecosystem of our solar system, which is the solar mind. Now we've got to there.
And that, in astrology, you see, is important. It's the movement.
Now we've got your limit. But a minute ago it was the Gaian mind. Now we've boosted you without rockets to the solar mind.
Other places in the solar system seem potentially open to the support of recognizable forms of life, the oceans of Europa.
No, but does it need recognizable life to have a mind? You see, in the Gaian mind, it is not only the so-called living beings in it, microbes included, that have mind, right? The ecosystem is a mind.
Well, but you don't want to define mind so broadly that it's no longer recognizable as what we say when we ordinarily use the word
that's
mind.
the problem. I think so.
Well, we don't know what we do use.
The Gaian system, as described by you yesterday beautifully, as this system of control, self-control, interpenetrating, holistic system, that the functions of all these different components of the complex system appear to think. I mean, they fit exactly our model of thinking. Now, to ask if it's conscious or unconscious is a different question, I think, which very much complicates the issue due to the fact that we have consciousness and unconsciousness.
Oh, well, I'm definitely into the notion that if you can't have an I-thou relationship with it, it's fairly uninteresting to call it a mind.
Well, do you think that the Gaian mind would then be dead if the human species became extinct?
No, any more than anyone else is dead if an acquaintance dies. I communicate with the Gaian mind.
Then why can't Jupiter have a Jupiterian mind without the necessity of microbes?
Oh, I grant that. It's these more diffuse abiological systems.
Well, no. Who said that? If Jupiter has one, the Sun.
The Sun is a hard step to take.
Well, this is one we discussed the other day. If
Right.
the Sun indeed is a very complex resonant pattern of magnetic fields,
It has neurons.
with little sort of cells and vortices throughout its whole surface, the whole thing with very complex resonant patterns, as has recently been shown, with complete magnetic polar reversals every 11 years, starting at sunspot maxima, and longer periods of resonance too. A very complex system of highly probabilistic turbulences, resonances, and so on. There's a physical interface if a mind has to have a physical interface, then there's a pretty good one for the Sun. And the solar system as a whole involves what's going on in all the planets, all the gravitational interactions, the electromagnetic field of the Sun, in which everything is made manifest. The electromagnetic field of the Sun includes us sitting here in this room. Everything that's illuminated. And if there's some kind of associated mind with the light, which is one of the things we started off saying, the solar mind, which is the source of the light, directly and indirectly, of everything that we see, is in a sense we're in it. We're in that solar. The light is coming from the Sun, and in a sense we're in it. So all things may be seen by the Sun. The Sun is often in many cultures called an eye in the sky. And on the dollar bill, that Eye of Horus, which is in the triangle there, but it's the radiant eye, it's the sun, it's not only the seer, but the emitter of light, which brings us back to the sort of theme from which we started, the connection between light and vision. And if the sun has both this inner dynamics, plus is the field of which all things in the solar system are seemingly related, plus is related to them all through the gravitational field. We've got galaxies, clusters, and the cosmos.
There's no doubt that we can jack them up the rest of the way.
But
I
where
think
is
that the problem has to do with divine omniscience.
Divine omniscience.
That's more difficult.
It certainly
that
is.
put you off. That's we should.
Because it implies a kind of
let
knowing
that
is never met with.
Well, that's surely implicit in the very concept of divine omniscience. Any notion that our consciousness is less than higher forms of consciousness implies there must be forms of knowing that we don't meet with.
But omniscience is a kind of mathematical notion, not something you could expect any biological system to attain. Biological systems just get, sentience and then a little more and a little more and then a lot. But divine omniscience is like mathematical absolute. It means certain knowledge of everything. That's some program.
Well, I just was suggesting the simple thought that conceive for the purposes of argument that there's some kind of sense of knowing associated with the electromagnetic field.
But
then would that not amount to complete knowledge of everything in the physical level?
Well,
does it include knowledge of the future?
I'm talking now about perceptual knowledge of the present. I mean, my discussion has been entirely centered on omniscience of I'm not now thinking of future, knowledge of the future.
That's a separate question.
Although this is the Laplacian thing, wasn't it? That if you knew the initial positions, i.e. in the present, this divinely omniscient mind could calculate all future.
Well, yes, that's Laplace, but that was in a deterministic universe where the God was modeled on Laplace. But what I'm talking about is divine omnipercipience, let's say, omniperception. That if there were a mind associated with the electromagnetic and the gravitational fields, the positions and everything that's happening in the universe would be known to it, not through some kind of external mind looking and examining it, but because this knowing would pervade these fields. There'd be nothing in the universe outside them on the physical level.
True, although within my own body I have very little understanding of what's going on.
Well, the divine omniscience may be, it may be as unconscious as your omniscience of what's going on in your body. What you need to know in your body is when something alters.
Right.
And if you had a pinprick, you'd instantly know it. But you'd know it by contrast with the non-pinprick state, because your present state is different from being asleep or
you might not
unconscious or comatose.
You see, the fact is that our mind is primarily unconscious, and consciousness is not a necessary consideration of omniscience. And it's, I think, a major fallacy of the modern system is to emphasize the grandeur of consciousness. To imagine that our mind is primarily conscious is just to deny the existence of the unconscious, which is part of the rational approach, is to the denial of the irrational. The fact is that consciousness is a drop on the bucket of the individual mind. And it could be that the Gaian mind is completely unconscious, and that wouldn't matter at all. I think that it functions as a mental being, and that even the concept of consciousness is inappropriate for the world soul, the cosmic mind, and so on. It's just not an appropriate concept. There's no need to project that little tiny self-reflection aspect of our own being onto the cosmic mind. It's unnecessary. One could discuss that at a future time.
Yeah, what do you think about that?
Well, I think that the cosmic mind may be largely unconscious, because I think that most things that happen in the cosmos are habitual and therefore unconscious. But there's a curious kind of consciousness or awareness associated with habituation. I mean, all sensory modes that we know of work on the principle of difference. What you detect are not fixed levels, like when you're sitting on a cushion. You're not sensing the pressure on your bottom. You habituate. And even in the simplest organisms, habituation is the first form of learning. It's the ability to sort of filter out or become unconscious of everything that's habitual in the environment. The way consciousness
Novelty
works,
is the big
yes,
thing.
what attracts attention is novelty. Anything new in the environment immediately attracts the attention of a person, an animal, or anything. And they usually react with fear, then followed by approach and curiosity, and then if it's harmless, it's just accept the part and ignore it. This pattern shown by pet dogs. It's
Gregory Bateson's theory of information.
So it's the difference that makes a difference. I mean, this is standard sensory physiology. It's not just Bateson. It's that sensory systems work on differences. And sensory perceptions are all based on differences. So you become sensorily aware, if you're just staring vacantly at a whole area of what we call the visual field, appropriately enough, you don't notice anything particular. As soon as there's any motion in it, your eye immediately battens onto the moving object. And this because it's a difference. So this is the way our senses work. Now, I think that if there were to be something like the Gaian mind or the mind of the solar system or even the galactic mind, that it would probably work in a similar way, be habituated to anything that stays the same or follows regular cycles. But it may be that consciousness would flare up, as it were, or become associated with anything that challenged, crisis, problem, pain, or anything that makes or any new thing that makes a difference. There might be a kind of rising of awareness about that in the Gaian mind. There might be, against a large background of unconsciousness, which is the way
what you're saying is novelty would drive this.
Novelty would drive it, and it would be driven by, and also discomfort, because there's certain kinds of pain that we have that persist and act as motivations for our behavior. And I think there'd have to be some kind of
So disequilibrium would drive it.
Yes.
It's a better term.
Yes, so there'd be disequilibrium and novelty. I mean, there'd be a variety of things that would drive it. But the reason I think that this is a reasonable view is that we see the same pattern, not just in our own minds, but this thing of sensory differences and habituation, right back to unicellular organisms and plants. And it seems to be a kind of universal mode of awareness, or at least of sensory awareness. And since we're talking about perceptual, the perception of the world soul, as it were, its sense, if the electromagnetic field is, as it were, its sense organ or a part of its sensory system, then something of this kind would apply.
We're talking about reductionist Gaian psychology.
Well, it's not just reductionist Gaian psychology. I mean, the electromagnetic field is only part of this, just as the electromagnetic changes in our brains are only part of the brain.
Well, it's valuable to parse the system into parts without necessarily reducing it to its sum of its parts.
We're talking at the moment, anyway, only about Gaian perception, not about Gaian understanding, nor about Gaian hopes, fears, and goals, and nor about Gaian dreams, nor about Gaian daydreams, nor about Gaian memories. So there's much more to the Gaian mind than its perceptual mode of knowing what's going on now. And light is just one of the aspects of that perceptual mode, as it's just one of the aspects through which we know the world around us. But somehow the light and what happens in the light has to be related to our vision. And so the question is, first this question of our own vision, how it's related to light.
Gaian vision.
And then how Gaian vision or other forms of vision are related to it.
Yes. So we're on the track of a cognitive map of the Gaian mind. That seems to be the appropriate level. We've tried smaller, we've tried larger. That feels comfortable this year.
Yes, that's right.
Yes.
A cognitive map of the Gaian mind.
Maybe we should rest at this point.
Yes.